Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lesson 11-2. We're going to look at the entirety of the George W. Bush presidency today. This would be Bush Jr., not referring to the president in the late 80s and early 90s. That would be his father. This is George Bush Jr., baby Bush. So Bush becomes president after the 2000 presidential election. This was an extremely contentious election, the most contentious in American history, and the only one that in the end had to be decided by the United States Supreme Court. And after this decision, Americans were extremely divided and became distrustful of elections in our country. Bush takes office, however, with a Republican Congress and a Republican Supreme Court. So for the first time in a while, all three branches of government were in the firm control of the Republican Party. Now, Republicans draw their inspiration from Ronald Reagan. Republicans believed that these Reagan Republican policies of low taxes and small government should be continued, and Bush certainly begins pushing out in that with that in mind. He helped pass steep tax cuts, huge cuts in taxes in America. And he also deregulated many industries. That is, he eliminated a lot of the rules that governed how businesses could do their business. Bush projected a budget surplus of $5.5 trillion. We were supposed to make a lot of money in the early 2000s, enough money to largely eliminate the entire national debt that had been built up going back for decades. But plans for this surplus, plans for the growth in the American economy and the elimination of the American debt were shattered by the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. Bush, who had planned on being a president entirely focused on domestic policies, is going to be forced into a situation where he has to deal with foreign policy. The 9/11 terrorist attacks, to summarize, was when Al-Qaeda attacked the United States, largely in protest to American involvement in Muslim nations. The attack destroyed the World Trade Center and wrecked parts of the Pentagon. In this attack, American planes, commercial airplanes, were hijacked by terrorists and used as guided missiles to strike at these symbols of American economy and military strength. And 3,000 Americans were killed on that one day as a result of these attacks. Now, on the flip side of this, it took an extremely divided nation. Our nation was divided by that 2000 presidential election, where Democrats were opposing many Bush policies. But the terrorist attacks unified Americans behind our government. Whatever our differences were, we could agree that the terrorists were an amazing threat to our country and something had to be done. So Americans rallied behind our president, and Bush's national job approval rating skyrocketed to 90% following the 9/11 attacks. Now, after 9/11, the United States had broad international support. The world was on our side. Nations rallied to show their support for American ideals and American military, the American way of life. And they joined in this massive coalition. When America decided to invade Afghanistan to go after Al-Qaeda, dozens of nations worldwide joined in this effort, willingly, enthusiastically, to stamp out an organization such as Al-Qaeda that would commit such an attack. But we do eventually lose this support when we get into the war in Iraq, and we'll go over that more at a later time. In 2001, shortly after the attack, the United States invades Afghanistan. Our purpose here is to overthrow the Taliban. The Taliban is a group that's in charge of that country. And we need to overthrow them because the Taliban was supporting and helping to hide Al-Qaeda. You see, Al-Qaeda is this small organization, very small. The Taliban is large enough to control a nation. And the Taliban had decided that they were going to support and help Al-Qaeda in their fight against America, or at least in defending Al-Qaeda. So this war in Afghanistan, this war against the Taliban and against Al-Qaeda, lasts 11 years. 11 years in Afghanistan to try to stamp out Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Now, the U.S. allies eventually do control the central government, but the Taliban is still fighting, and they are still fighting today. This war is still ongoing. It says here that it has lasted 11 years. This is an older lesson. I wrote this several years ago. It's pretty much still going. We're around 17 years now that this fight has been going in Afghanistan. And there are still U.S. military troops in Afghanistan fighting against the Taliban. This has become America's longest war. The war in Iraq comes a couple of years later. The Bush administration, George W. Bush, was convinced that Iraq was stockpiling weapons and that their plan was to sell these weapons to terrorists. In particular, he was concerned about weapons of mass destruction. These are chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. Now, after the invasion of Iraq, these weapons are never found. And Bush loses a lot of international support. A lot of our allies had said that they were not going to get into the war in Iraq no matter what. They disagreed with us going in there without proof. And when we couldn't even find proof after we had invaded and overthrown their government, we lost even more international support and respect. This go-it-alone policy really was not popular throughout the world. Let's look at domestic policy. President Bush began his presidency by advocating for Reagan-like policies: low taxes, low government spending. But 9/11 disrupts our plans to focus on that economy. And though well-intentioned, many Bush policies, like those of Carter, just didn't work. The American economy did not thrive and succeed under George W. Bush. The problem here comes from the tax cuts themselves. In 2001 and 2003, Congress in the United States passed huge tax cuts, really dropping the American tax rate. And this was supposed to stimulate business, but it also severely decreased government revenue. Now, we were supposed to make this money back because businesses were supposed to do so much better. As businesses do better, they pay more taxes even though it's at a smaller rate, and the government is able to make money. But it just doesn't work. We don't make enough money. And Bush spent more money in the end than any president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was supposed to be cutting spending, but instead increased spending dramatically as we geared up for two wars, war in Afghanistan and war in Iraq, while cutting taxes. This low taxes and high spending increased the national debt significantly. So we can see here, this line across the center is kind of our zero line. If you're below that, you're losing money. If you're above it, we're making money. So we can see during the Clinton years, with the help of Congress, he didn't do it by himself, the economy starts to do a lot better. And then Bush takes over, 9/11 happens, and tax cuts happen, and all of a sudden we're way down here, losing more money than we ever had before in modern times. Additionally, we also had scandals. Troubles in the White House decreased Americans' faith in the president. These were multiple and several corruption problems. Bush's Attorney General, Alberto Gonzales, made a lot of politically motivated firings. He fired people because they were Democrats. You can't do that. You can fire people for almost any reason you want, but it can't be because they're of the other political party. You can hire new people that are just Republicans, but firing somebody just because they're a Democrat was not a cool thing to do within the Justice Department. Also, we had Vice President Dick Cheney, who was involved in exposing the identity of his undercover CIA agent. He disagreed with some statements her husband had made, and so she was outed. And this is a dangerous thing to do. And actions like that make America very distrustful of the government. Additionally, beginning in 2008, right at the end of his presidency, the United States entered our deepest recession since 1929. This was because of deregulation. Deregulation of banking, these Reagan-like policies. Remember, less rules for businesses while we had less rules for banks, and that did not end very well. So the recession was triggered by that deregulation. We had run large budget deficits before this recession, It makes it even more potentially dangerous to try to spend your way out of a recession, which is how you're supposed to do it, because we were already running huge deficits. In the end, we will spend our way out of this recession, and under the Obama years, run even larger deficits than we did under Bush, because we had no surplus before to work on our spending. All right, so Bush's popularity. Beginning in 2005, public opinion turned against the president. In 2006, Democrats retake control of both houses of Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And in 2008, a Democrat, Barack Obama, easily wins the presidential election. Now, many today consider Bush to have been the worst post-World War II American president. That is the worst president that our country has had since Franklin Roosevelt. Recent polls have updated this. President Donald Trump is giving Bush a run for his money for this worst American president label. But certainly his presidency by almost any metric was not a successful one. He did not, in the end, wind up being a good president for our country. All right, that's all that we have for today's lesson. I hope you learned something. I'll see you next time, and farewell.